Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 13 of the online edition of The Hindu. This column deals with the series of military coups that have hit several West African countries. It evaluates the emerging crisis in West Africa and how the failure of democracy and the rise in military coups are spreading across the West African region. So let's look at this topic in complete detail and also talk about how these events in West Africa could affect Indian interests as far as its African diplomacy is concerned. See, over the last few months, multiple military coups have been witnessed in West African countries. For beginners who want to know what is a military coup, it is essentially the capture of state power from a civilian government by the military. It leads to the collapse of democracy and results in the establishment of military dictatorship. And over the last few months in West Africa, also referred to as the Sahel region, at least 5 back-to-back military coups have been witnessed. First in 2020, there was a military coup in Mali, followed by military coups in Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, and recently in Burkina Faso. Then if you move slightly eastwards, we have also seen recent military coups in Sudan, and this has highlighted the concerns for the survival of democracy in African states. But however, military coups are not new to African countries, especially to those countries in West Africa. Now just look at this graph, which shows the number of military coups which have taken place over the last few years in the sub-Saharan African region. This region, which extends across Western and Eastern Africa, used to witness a very high number of military coups back in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. According to data provided in the article, there were at least 15 military coups in the 1960s and 24 in 1970s, 17 in 1980s, 23 in 1990s. But over the last 2 decades, the number of military coups had gone down, and hence the sudden rise in these incidents, which seems to be spreading contagiously from one country to another, has caused a lot of concern, not just for the regional groupings such as African Union and ECOWAS or the Economic Community of West African States, but also for the larger international community. Many of these coups witnessed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s had a link with the Cold War that was going on between the Soviet Union and the United States. Plus, there were also the domestic factors, such as lack of economic development and government corruption, which was leading to declining faith in democratic institutions and democratic governments. But as the Cold War came to an end in 1991, the number of military coups in sub-Saharan Africa also declined, following which the African countries adopted a declaration known as the Lome Declaration of 2000. Through this, the African leaders made a commitment to democratic principles and to prevent the occurrence of such military coups in order to protect human rights and democratic rights. Later, the ECOWAS community also adopted a protocol that provided for the free movement of citizens, thus improving trade and economy. You should note that ECOWAS is a regional economic community of West African countries established in 1975 and consists of 15 member countries. Following this, with improvement in economy and with added support from the African Union, which is the regional organization, the number of such military coups went down over the next 2 decades. But in the last 2 years again, these incidents have risen, and it appears to be spreading from one country to another. See, even though the reasons for these military coups are different from country to country, there are a few common factors which have contributed to these developments. This graph over here explains how most of these countries in West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa rank very low on the democratic scoreboard. Their democracy index is very low, which also happens to be a direct result of their low GDP per capita. On this scale, you can see how countries like Mali, Guinea, Sudan, Chad, Ghana, and the others are performing, and it clearly indicates that most of these countries have a very weak democratic foundation along with very poor economic development. Then, upon this, these countries in West Africa have been of late hit by terrorism due to the rise of radical jihad led by terrorist outfits such as the Islamic State in the West African province and the branch of Al Qaeda in the Sahel region. Most of these countries, including Mali, have been deeply affected by jihadist terror, which has led to large scale violence in these countries. Then, upon this, the governments of these countries had become very unpopular due to poor development and massive government corruption, thus leading to the loss of their popular appeal amongst the masses. In fact, in some of these countries, when the recent military coups happened, the younger crowds, especially in urban areas, were actually welcoming the military takeover, which clearly reflects their disaffection towards the civilian government. This massive failure in governance and rise in government corruption is directly attributed to the inclination of several African leaders to promote their personal wealth and personal power, which has also led to the people losing faith in democratic governments. So, a combination of these factors, aided by the challenges created by climate change, has led to a popular support for military rule and military takeovers, and particularly the challenges and hardships created by terrorism and insurgency, has played a role in shifting public opinion towards military rule and stronger governments. So these developments are of great concern for democracy in Africa, and we can't just assume that this is a faraway problem. Because stability in Africa is crucial for the global economy, and even for India, there are several core interests at stake in Africa, even in West Africa. This map clearly illustrates how African countries have been hit by repeated attempts of military coup since the 1950s. For example, look at countries like Sudan. They have witnessed more than 17 military coups. The same is the case across the sub-Saharan belt or the Sahel region, and countries like Burkina Faso, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Nigeria, Chad, Benin, and Togo. They've all been affected by military takeovers, which has substantially weakened democracy in the region and has even set a wrong precedent. So, this is what results in a wave of military coups in the region. Because once if it happens in one country, it will quickly spread to other countries as well, as it inspires the militaries to topple the civilian governments due to unpopularity, and as the military juntas also enjoy greater support from the public. Here you should note that military dictatorships are often referred to as the military junta. So now coming to the definition of a military coup, it is defined as an illegal and overt attempt by the military or other elites and security forces who are functioning within the state apparatus to unseat or to remove or to topple the sitting executive. Such an executive is often an elected civilian government. So the return of military coups to West Africa is of great concern, and this instability in the region has even led France to again intervene in the region. Because France happens to be the former colonial power in some of these West African countries, and after terrorism broke out in Mali, and after Islamic State and Al Qaeda created a presence here, France has even deployed its military to help the country tackle the terrorist threat. Even the United States is closely involved in counterterrorism in West Africa, but all these efforts are of no use if there is no economic growth and development, and if there is no strengthening of democratic institutions. Following these series of military coups, the regional organizations have responded, and the African Union and ECOWAS, they have not only suspended these countries from their membership to these organizations, but they have also imposed crippling economic sanctions against them. But experts are of the opinion that these economic sanctions are going to be counterproductive, as it will only deepen the economic suffering in these poor countries, which could further lead to the strengthening of the military's hold over the government. So it is in this context that we need to examine the impact of these developments on India's interests in West Africa. See, over the last 15 years, India has been very proactive when it comes to its African diplomacy. India engages very closely with the African Union and as well as with ECOWAS. And in fact, India has even conducted several rounds of India Africa Summit. But traditionally, India's primary focus in Africa is Eastern Africa and Southern Africa. This is where India has made most of its investments. But of late, India had started diversifying in order to build stronger relations with West African states as well. This is primarily because West African countries are also blessed with great resources, and China has already taken a huge leap ahead of India by emerging as a key trading partner and investor for most of these African countries. So while India has been able to compete with Chinese influence in Eastern and Southern Africa, it didn't have much of an influence in West Africa. But to correct this, over the last 15 years, India has stepped up its investments and has tried to broaden the diplomatic relationship with West African countries. These tables illustrate the growing Indian investments in West African states. Even though the volume of investments are pretty low, it still shows an active outreach by India to become a major player in West African countries because they not only have great resource potential, but they also represent a massive market for Indian exports. So this makes it clear that the fall of democratic governments in West Africa and the rise in instability and terrorism is going to affect Indian interests and investments in the region. Now let's take up another column from page number 13 of the online edition of the Hindu. This column helps us evaluate the new Central Media Accreditation Guidelines. But first, let's understand what is media accreditation. See, accreditation helps journalists from various media outlets to gain access to government offices and to the various special events and functions organized by government departments and ministries, and as well as to gain access to the press briefings by the government, which is conducted through the PIB or the Press Information Bureau. So, for a journalist to have access to government offices, to government press briefings, and to government events, they need to be accredited with the government. In fact, certain sensitive ministries like Home Ministry, Defense, Finance, etc., they allow access to journalists only if they have obtained the required accreditation. So let's see how journalists can get accredited. See, a journalist who has a minimum of 5 years of experience and who has worked as a full-time journalist, they can apply for accreditation. They need to submit the application to the PIB, following which a mandatory security check and background check is conducted by the Ministry of Home Affairs. This is because journalists who have been given such access will be able to get hold of sensitive information, which if misused could seriously affect the interests of the government. In certain cases, this could even translate to a national security risk. So accordingly, only those journalists who are working for reputed media outlets and established media organizations are eligible for applying for government accreditation. Such journalists will have to be working with a newspaper which has a daily circulation of at least 10,000, and the news agencies they work for should have at least 100 subscribers. And if they work for a digital news platform, they should have at least 1 million unique visitors. So recently, the government, that is the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting or the INB Ministry, has notified the Central Media Accreditation Guidelines 2022. As per these new guidelines, the conditions for withdrawal of accreditation has been outlined by the government. These new guidelines provide for specific conditions under which an accredited journalist could lose their accreditation if they report in a manner which is prejudicial to the country's security, sovereignty, and integrity, or friendly relations with foreign governments, or to public order, or if charged with a serious cognizable offense. So these are essentially restrictions being imposed on journalists, and the government considers them to be reasonable restrictions because freedom of speech and freedom of press guaranteed under Article 19 is subjected to a list of reasonable restrictions. The freedom of speech and expression and the freedom of press is not absolute, And Clause 2 of Article 19 provides for these reasonable restrictions. And on these grounds, the freedom of press and the freedom of speech and expression can be restricted and curbed by the government. These new guidelines are different from the past guidelines and they appear to be more stringent. Because see, the previous guidelines brought out by the Ministry of I&B, they were more general in nature as compared to the specific nature of the provisions in the new guidelines. So they are more in the nature of proscriptions rather than prescriptions. In the new guidelines, 10 specific conditions have been outlined under which the accreditation given to a journalist can be withdrawn by the government. So this detailed and specific nature of guidelines has led to suspicion that the government is trying to censor the media through these censorship rules and has already drawn criticism from the media. As per the new guidelines, they will be implemented by a committee which shall be constituted by the Government of India called the Central Media Accreditation Committee. This committee would be chaired by the Principal DG or Director General of the PIB and will comprise of 25 members who will be nominated by the government to interpret and enforce these guidelines for the withdrawal of accreditation. But the stringent nature of these guidelines has raised a lot of concerns with regard to freedom of press in the country. And this is quite a serious concern because India already ranks very low on the World Press Freedom Index, which is brought out by Reporters Without Borders. This is a global collective of journalists and media outlets, which is based out of Paris, and it comes out with the World Press Freedom Index to indicate the extent of press freedom enjoyed in different countries. On this index, India's ranking is extremely poor and stands at the 142nd position out of 180 countries. Yes, it is true that the Indian Constitution does not explicitly mention freedom of press. But however, the freedom of speech and expression guaranteed under Article 19 has been interpreted by the courts to constitute freedom of press as well. So the fear is that these new guidelines could become a restrictive censorship policy on journalists, especially on those who are seen to be critical of the government. There is a fear that any report which is critical of the government and its functioning could be interpreted by this committee as prejudicial to the interests of the country, thus leading to the withdrawal of the accreditation of the journalist. This will also end up delegitimizing these media reports, thus running the risk of compromising freedom of press in India. But however, the government has dismissed these concerns and has stated that these guidelines are necessary to ensure that media integrity is maintained and upheld, and to ensure that media reporting doesn't go against the interests of the nation. Then we should also note that this is not the first time that such attempts are being made to regulate the media. Attempts have been made in the past as well to bring certain regulations on the manner in which journalists and media outlets report. In fact, in 2018, the PIB had issued a fake news guideline, which had also become very controversial. As per this guideline, the PIB had stated that the accreditation given to a journalist could be cancelled and withdrawn if they are seen to be peddling and promoting fake news. The vague and loosely defined provisions of these guidelines had led to suspicion back then as well that the government was trying to censor the media by seeking to impose such unreasonable restrictions. Similar attempts have been made by state governments like Kerala and Rajasthan as well, but later they were withdrawn following intense criticism. Then another incident which comes to mind was the infamous Defamation Bill of 1988, which was proposed by the then Rajiv Gandhi government, which was also seen as a government attempt to control the media, and following a controversy, the bill was withdrawn. Now let's look at these two articles from page number 11. Quad ministers are all set to meet in Australia. See, the Quad or the Quadrilateral is an informal grouping of 4 like-minded democracies, that is India, United States, Japan, and Australia. These 4 countries have come together under this informal grouping known as the Quad, with the primary objective of enforcing a rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region in order to maintain it as a free and open region. These objectives of the Quad are a direct result of China's aggression across the Indo-Pacific, which was threatening to disrupt the rules-based order. For example, China's growing military aggression in the South China Sea had led to the disruption of freedom of navigation and as well as freedom of overflight, which is a recognized right under international laws such as the UN Clause or the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. But by going against these rules and by refusing to obey the orders of international institutions, China was seen to be threatening the rules-based order and was also seen to be threatening the free and open nature of the Indo-Pacific. This is what led to these four democratic nations to come together under the Quad with the objective of establishing the rules-based order in order to protect the free and open nature of the Indo-Pacific region. So in the initial years, the grouping was largely seen as a strategic and diplomatic grouping, but countries like US, Japan and Australia made an attempt to give it a military angle as well. But as India was hesitant to be a part of any military alliance, today the quadrilateral has been diversified into other areas and into other sectors, thereby projecting the group as a broader strategic group focused on the Indo-Pacific region. But however, China has always been critical of this grouping and has even referred to it as the Asian NATO. China believes that the Quad grouping has been designed to contain and restrict China's rise and has blamed these countries, particularly the US, for bringing back the Cold War mindset. But however, the Quad members deny these allegations and they have said that the Quad is neither a military alliance nor a security alliance. It is just a broad strategic grouping which is focused on several key issues affecting the Indo-Pacific, one of them being the disruption of rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. Apart from this objective, the Quad has even diversified into other key sectors such as vaccine development, pandemic management, along with initiatives to boost cooperation in the field of critical emerging technologies such as 5G and artificial intelligence, with the added objective of strengthening global supply chains and making them resilient, along with focusing on climate change and infrastructure creation. Last year in September, the first ever Quad summit was held between the leaders of these countries, during which these diversified initiatives were announced. And to follow up on these initiatives, the respective foreign ministers are meeting in Australia, and India's foreign minister, Dr. Jaishankar, is all set to take part in this diplomatic event. Following his participation in the Quad foreign ministers meeting, the foreign minister will be traveling to Philippines to further take forward India-Philippines defense trade relations after the countries signed a landmark deal with India to procure the BrahMos cruise missile. Philippines has shown interest to procure even more BrahMos missiles along with other defense platforms, including the ALH Through helicopter, and this explains why the foreign minister is visiting Philippines after the Quad meeting. Next, we have another article on page number 11, according to which India has banned the import of drones in order to support the domestic drone sector. The government has imposed an immediate ban on the import of drones, except for the drones that are used for research and development and defense and security purposes. These orders have been notified by the Directorate General of Foreign Trade under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry and under the Indian Trade Classification Harmonized System 2022. The prohibition on the import of drones has been notified. This is expected to boost the domestic manufacturing of drones within India because recently the government has liberalized the drone sector with the aim of encouraging research and development and domestic production of drones in order to transform India into a global hub of drone production. The government has even approved a PLI scheme or a production linked incentive scheme of 120 crore rupees for this sector. Now let's look at this article from page number 8. The government has informed the parliament that there is no official usage of the term urban naxals. This issue came up in the parliament because several leaders of the ruling party have often targeted their political opponents, journalists and social activists and intellectuals and they have branded them as urban naxals, particularly when they are critical of the government. In fact, the term urban naxals is actually a derogatory term which largely spread on social media platforms, where party leaders and supporters of the party have often targeted the critics of government, and in an attempt to delegitimize their criticism, they have been branded as urban naxals. So, when a clarification was sought in this regard, the government has informed the parliament that officially it does not designate anyone as urban naxals. Yes, it is true that naxals or Maoists, they could have urban sympathizers who could be extending them ideological support and maybe even financial support. But however, they are treated just as Naxal sympathizers by the government and the security agencies, and officially there is no term such as urban Naxals which is used by the government or the security agencies. Then the minister who answered the question in the parliament has also presented important data on the extent of spread of Naxalism in India. See, at one point, Naxalism, which is a type of left-wing extremism, was India's biggest internal security threat. At its peak, more than 180 districts were affected, that is, nearly 33% of the country was affected, with at least around 80 to 90 districts being severely affected. In fact, in many districts in the Naxal corridor, the Naxals had even managed to establish their complete influence by even displacing the civilian administration. But over the last 15 years, due to intense security operations by the government, followed by better development and better governance, the influence of Naxalism has gone down in the country, and in 2010, just around 96 districts were affected. Now in 2021, these numbers have gone down further, and according to the government, just around 46 districts today are affected by Naxal violence, and out of them, only 25 districts are reporting the maximum violence. In fact, even the number of Naxal incidents has seen a major decline of 77% because in the year 2009, nearly 2,258 incidents were reported compared to just around 509 incidents being reported in 2021. This data offered by the government clearly points to the declining threat of Naxalism and how the extent of its influence has declined in central and eastern parts of India. Now let's take a look at the mains practice questions. The first question: a wave of military coups have hit West Africa again, and it not only threatens regional stability but also affects Indian interests. Comment. The second question: critically examine the new Central Media Accreditation Guidelines. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box below. So with this, let's conclude our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.